Hi, I'm Julia from Family and we're at Nursery World 2023. I'm here with early years specialist Dubiel, and he's agreed to sit with us and answer some questions. So Jan, welcome and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Julia.
So the last time Family spoke to you was back in 2020, and we were talking then about how to build a meaningful curriculum in the early years. Despite everything that's happened since, do you feel that as a sector we're a bit more comfortable now with curricula, building our own curriculum in our settings? What do you feel the progress has been made?
Well, it's an interesting question, and we are at an interesting point in time, particularly if you take that as a reference point. And that was during the time when the EYFS was still in process, as it were. And I think certainly philosophically we were at a very different place. I think the understanding of curricula has improved and deepened, but I think we are still on a journey. And I think, as with any change in behaviour, you have interesting variations of that, where some people go very extreme, some people revert back to what they know, and generally, step by step, we get to a different point. So I think in a lot of ways we're still in that process. I think the EYFS, is now a year and a half it's been embedded. I think it was a sort of, in some ways, a slow burn seismic shift, particularly around that idea of focusing on the concept of curriculum, the what is learned, and the sort of essence of that. And I think we are still moving in that direction. I think, and I possibly talked about this 3 years ago, I think one of the biggest tensions is that tension between the what and the how, and how they sometimes get conflated. So the pedagogical, cut that. So the pedagogy or the pedagogical repertoire, the process, is not the curriculum. And one of the projects I'm involved in with a group of schools in south of England is putting together some materials about how we structure that. And I work with them quite closely, and it was really interesting when we talked about curriculum progression. They would almost, to start with, just slide back into activities. And I kept saying, no, that's an activity, that's not the learning. So being able to define out and delineate the learning that you want to take place, which, let's face it, is dull and dry and a bit dusty. It's the pedagogy that makes it exciting. But that's a really important process, because that helps us understand why we're doing what we're doing. So I feel quite confident about the direction things are taking. I think some of the thinking around it and some of the approaches people are using are really interesting. And as ever with the early years community, there's a whole unique diversity of how that's being addressed. And it's always a, whenever you work with early years educators, it's always a privilege and a surprise to see just how creative and responsive and dynamic they are about it. So I think we're in an interesting place on that journey. I think the other factor to throw in there is obviously we can't get away from the fact that the children who are going into earlier settings now are this mini COVID generation. They're children who were born or grew up under COVID. Their whole enculturation of the world, their whole neurological development happened in very, very extreme, atypical circumstances. So those children are now in our EYFS settings, and their experiences are very different. And I do think, particularly at the moment, we have a very, very direct responsibility to make sure we ameliorate some of the impact of that. Otherwise, we are storing up another pandemic in years to come of children who haven't aligned with the world in the way that they would have done previously. And I think that's a really salient issue at the moment.
With that in mind, actually, I wanted to talk a bit about the stage after the EYFS. So we read a lot at the moment about a decline in school readiness. So children who are leaving the early years foundation stage at maybe at a disadvantage compared to previous cohorts. Thinking about, getting ready for school or getting ready for the next stage, should we be thinking more about that in our curricula for the early years?
I think the issue of transition has always been a strong one, and I think the same. Although I think COVID has illuminated that or intensified that, I think the issue is the same one, which is the whole dynamic or the tension between either children getting ready for school or school getting ready for the children. And obviously, you know, there are different schools of thought on and different, you know, perceptions on either side, and probably the reality and the most reasonable approach is somewhere in the middle. So as any early years educator, you would be considering the next stage of education and ensuring that children were equipped and skilled to be able to gain from that. But equally, as an educator who is taking in a group of children, you start with where they are. You start with, you know, where they are in terms of their development, their knowledge, understanding, their behaviours, their skills, and so on. And you work with that and build upon that. So I think that dynamic is a complex one. I don't think it's as simple as saying if they could do this, and they're ready for school. You know, that I think there are intricacies around that which we have to be aware of. And I think good transition models acknowledge that. They see transition as a process. They see it as a dialogue between the incumbent and the previous setting, and they share information. They share information about the uniqueness of children. And I think particularly at the moment, given, as I said, what's happened in terms of sort of post-COVID, that's going to become really critical.
Absolutely. The other thing I wanted to ask is, your seminar today is about building a responsible curriculum. Very briefly, can you speak a little bit about what that means?
Well, the headline to that is, if we've learned anything for the past 3 years, we've learned that life can be very unpredictable, and that we've all been through this incredibly traumatic, uncharted experience. And it happened practically overnight. Overnight, your certainties about the world can change dramatically, and I think that's a very strong lesson from what's happened. So the world that children are growing up into is very unpredictable. We don't know what the future is going to be like for them in 5, 6, 10 years' time. We know technology is increasing at a rapid pace. We know there are issues around climate change. We know there are issues around social and economic change. We know the world in some ways is shrinking because of technology, and all that goes into the mix. So to be responsible to those children, we need to ensure that they are prepared for that, and that requires a type of curriculum that empowers them to think, be flexible, be adaptable, be resilient, all the things which I think the past 3 years have challenged us with. So the idea of a responsible curriculum is asking the question, how well does this prepare children for an unknowable future? We don't know what that's going to look like. So we can only do what we can give. We can only do what we can to give children the opportunity or the possibility of coping with whatever happens and is flung at them in whatever way. So that's one angle of responsibility. But there's also, I think, and actually the family report was kind of instrumental in the drive for this, is the perception of the early years community. And your report made it clear that we still suffer from an image problem. We still suffer from an understanding of what we do. And that's not, I don't believe there's any big conspiracy about it. I just think there's a lack of understanding, because early years is very unique, it's very specific. In some ways, educationally, it's very counterintuitive in terms of how we do what we do. So I think part of our responsibility is making sure we communicate that message effectively. And part of that responsibility is engaging with the wider, certainly educational sphere, to ensure there's a deeper understanding of how what we do feeds in as a continuum for what happens later. So part of that responsibility, I think, is how we have that conversation, how we have that dialogue.
I think that's really, really interesting. And the perception, despite all this work of raising awareness at the moment, I do agree. I feel like it hasn't moved the needle all that much. And I recall clearly when I was working in settings 10 plus years ago, I would come home exhausted and my friends would say, well, you've just been playing all day. How can you be so tired? So there isn't an understanding of what we do in the sector.
No. And I think that's interesting. I think that's twofold, because partly I think that's the perception, the kind of cultural and residual perception of what we do. And I hesitate to say it, but I will say it. I also think as a community, as a sector, we don't always do ourselves favours in the way we portray and represent ourselves. And you know, I was, as you were, I was an early years educator for many years, and I think you do develop a siege mentality, because what you do is put under so much spotlight and so much pressure and so much misunderstanding. But unfortunately, I think it comes with the territory now that we need to be advocates in terms of what we do. The other element of that is that we need to be really clear that early years education is a serious business. What we do is both massively important and massively important to get right. So actually, the intensity of being an early years educator and the decisions you take and the repertoires that you have and all the exhausting nature of how that is because getting it right for early children is so difficult, but also so critical. And I think people are starting to realise that, and I agree. I don't think the needle's moving as quickly as we'd like it to. But if there's, for example, I mean, I think we struggle to find any silver in the COVID cloud. But I think one of the things that happened was that during lockdown, many people had to look after their own early years children. And I think that has built a momentum of respect for what we do, because they would have one child and that we would have, as educators, we would have 20, 30 children with, a couple of other adults possibly, and so on. So I think that there is coming out of that an awareness that this job is demanding and it's difficult, and that's just not just looking after children, but providing education, providing the trajectory for them, developing, teaching them, and so on. So I think we can build on that. But yeah, like you, I would like to see that needle move quicker and sort of perhaps to crank up. But I think that's not just about everybody else. That is also about how we represent ourselves and how we represent and how we talk about and describe and frame what we do.
I agree. I really agree. Something else I wanted to ask you regarding curriculum is, while we can talk about how we create it and how we develop it, there is a lot of confusion about how that might be documented or enshrined, especially if we're talking about a curriculum that's unique and fits the development of our unique cohort. Do we run the risk, if we document our entire curriculum, that it becomes too rigid? How would you advise we get the balance right there?
Yeah, again, it's a really good question, and again, one of the drivers for the revision of EYFS was to reduce paperwork and increase time for interaction and teaching, which is as it should be. I think my starting point is we are accountable for the impact we have on children. We are accountable and should be accountable for the progress children make. That's the bottom line. That's undisputable. So it then comes to, well, how do you document that? And I would say that matters less than the impact you have. We often talk about unique children. Educators are also unique. They have different ways of doing things, different way of seeing things, different way of framing things, different way of getting to that point, if you like. So I think we need, and again, I would say that's fully supported in the EYFS framework, we need to be as flexible and open and as possible in terms of how that's documented. We need to be able to demonstrate children make progress, but I'm only interested in how that's documented if that's not working. If that's not, well, when I go into settings and I see that progress happening and it's really vibrant, it's really exciting, and it's really clear, I'm not that interested in how they've planned for it, because it's clearly working. So I think we need to take an approach that supports professional judgment, that enables people to articulate their curriculum, and if they need to document it, then I think those are professional decisions. I think what we need to be really clear about, and we might sort of blend into this is how we demonstrate that progress happens. So, I mean, throughout my career, I've been interested in assessment and the way we represent children's learning that's, unique and idiosyncratic and so on. And I think what we have with curriculum is we're talking about the curriculum experience and what we want children to learn. And we are moving, as I said, we're moving in that direction. What we also need to do is make sure that alongside that, we have a clear understanding of how that is landing and how that is impacting on children's learning. And again, I think one thing we've learned from research is that's not just about the academic, what we might call the academic areas or the areas of learning development. That's also critically and fundamentally about what I would describe as learning behaviours, what is broadly within the characteristics of effective learning. Because actually, much of what children learn and develop is the schema and architecture of how to be a learner and how to act as a learner and how to inform their learning alongside the knowledge and skills that they acquire. So understanding that and being able to be able to frame and articulate that, I think is critically important.
I think that's really, really interesting. And I know, historically at least, having written hundreds of assessments for early years children myself, that we was very dependent on, at the time, development matters and looking at what statements children could do and which statement would they do next. And it was very linear and rigid in that respect. I would love to see, like you say, more assessment, or maybe perhaps not even assessment, acknowledgement of the behaviour that leads to those things being possible.
Absolutely.
Because the difficulty is those are a little bit more intangible, because it's very difficult to quantify how able or willing a child is to learn. I don't know if you have any advice for that.
I agree. No, I agree. It's a difficult one. I think people have shied away from it because actually assessing learning behaviours, assessing metacognition, for example, or executive functioning, or even self-regulation, although we have that as a learning goal. I think, you're right. People stand back and say, well, that's difficult to quantify. And it is difficult to quantify, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and find a way of representing it. So one of the things I've started talking a lot about is how the kind of levels of depth that children acquire within both concrete knowledge in the areas of learning development, but also learning behaviours. So for me, the part of the distinction, and it links into what we know about neuroscience, what we know about memory, and what we know about retrieval and so on. When children do something independently and they take it into their everyday activity and they utilise some knowledge or skills, we know that that's really secure. If they need an adult to prompt them, we know that they might know something, but they're still not relating it and applying it to their everyday life. So I think there are I've talked about these kind of 3 stages of acquisition, where you go from not knowing something or being able to do something to doing something when you're supported by an adult or provoked or asked by an adult, and then to applying it independently in your everyday everyday activity. And I think that, which comes from Vygotsky and the zone of proximal development and going from known to unknown, I think that provides an element of progress in terms of a concept, knowledge or skill. So I think you can talk about children who can't self-regulate, then who co-regulate with an adult, and then self-regulate themselves. There's a clear progression within that. And we can say, and we should be saying, that is significant progress. Equally, we can have children who can't think cognitively, that can't have cognitive flexibility, can then do it when they're supported by an adult, and then do it independently and tell you about it. Again, those are clear phases of development, and I think we can assess on that. So we might need to reconceptualise how we think about assessment. And I think you mentioned Development Matters. Development Matters was written with good faith, and it was designed as a framework to support learning, and it for all kinds of reasons, it ended up being what you described, which was in some cases quite a superficial tick list. anything, Howard Gardner talks about this. He talks about coverage being the enemy of learning, that when you cover something, which is what some people ended up doing, you skim across the surface of something and you don't know whether that knowledge is really deeply held or not. And I think, the Ofsted definition of knowledge, which is, a change in long-term memory, I think is exhibited by children in early years doing things autonomously and independently without adult support, but demonstrating that skill is internalised and rehearsed and secure. So again, I think as we've looked at curriculum, I think alongside that, maybe we need to have a more open view of what we mean by assessment and how we assess, and not just assessing coverage, but assessing the depth of which that has been learnt.
When you were describing there about learning something, or rather not knowing it, being taught it or supported by an adult and then applying it in everyday life, it puts me in mind of the type of activity planning or the type of development planning where settings have a colour of the week or a letter of the week. And I wonder if it might be helpful to revisit that type of learning, but through that lens. Because are we allowing children to go in depth enough in that kind of progression model if we plan for subjects like that, do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, the issue of planning is a really interesting one, and in a sense we've touched on it already in terms of how you plan the curriculum, and I think the possibilities around that are quite infinite. So you do have people who have topics or themes or follow projects, like the Reggio Emilia type approach. You do have people or settings who start with children's interests and then evolve that into how you might access elements of the curriculum. So I think there's I don't think there's one lens of doing that. I think we have a framework with the early learning goals, which are our aspirations at the end, but going up to that point, I think there's a huge amount of autonomy and possibility for doing that. Curriculums need to be individual because they have to respond to the cohort that you work with. It's very difficult, or I would say it's very difficult to understand a curriculum that's given to somebody because you don't know how that's going to land with the children. You don't know what their experiences are, you don't know what their levels of development are, you don't know what the context they exist in, what the culture within and around the school is. So you have to modify and distill what they're learning, and that's why it's so important to distinguish between learning and the what and the how, because we can all say yes, children need to have a sense of number. They need to know that number conservation, the last number you say is the total number, and so on. That's a piece of learning, that's a piece of curriculum. How you do that could be infinite. You might use songs and rhymes, you might use counting in everyday situations, you might do direct. There's a whole host of infinite possibilities around that. And I think one of the things I've always believed is we need to trust practitioners' own personal pedagogical repertoire in that to get children and to support and guide children to get to what it is we want them to learn. That is a constant, but what it looks like and even how children demonstrate it will be different.
I think that's really interesting, and I also think in a way it's comforting for educators to know that they can adapt what they want children to learn by how they deliver it.
Absolutely.
I think that's really, really, and it's a vote of confidence for us as educators to have the autonomy to do that. As a final question, which leads us on actually quite nicely from what we just spoke about, the talk you're taking part in this afternoon is about playing or learning. Why does the language we use around that matter? Why is it important?
Yeah, so it's probably my most contentious and maverick view in the community, but yeah, it's not about the concept of play, which obviously I agree with, but it's about the way we describe it and frame it, partly to ourselves, but particularly how we then represent that to the wider community. So I think the word play is contested and confused. I think it's often used quite incoherently. There isn't a clear definition. But what we are clear about is that when children are engaged in activity, it's very serious, and it's very intense, and it's very significant. So I absolutely understand the attachment to the word play, because it feeds into children's rights, it feeds into our whole history as a community. But I do think we need to be brave enough to say, is it the right word to describe what children do? Because the word play, the definition of the word play is something trivial or something for a leisure purpose. Young children's lives are not trivial, and what they do is not trivial. You watch children in self-led situations, it's very intense, it's very significant. And actually, the Marie Montessori, one of the pioneers of early education, agreed with me, or I agree with her, because she said at the time she was writing, she was way ahead of her time. If you read anything that she wrote at the turn of the last century, she was way ahead of thinking. There was this whole distinction between play and work. And schools or education at the time was quite formal, quite didactic, quite instructional. And so the word work implied a very formalised type of learning. So the word play emerged as the alternative to that, or as part of the spectrum of behaviours within that, very much like it is today. But what she then said is we need to acknowledge that play is a child's work. Their work is when they play. Now, people often quote that bit. What they don't then say is, she went on to say, which is why we shouldn't call it play, we should call it work. So she advocated that children did their work when they self-led their own activities, but she was very clear on calling it work because she felt, like I do, the word play trivialises it. Now that's not what people intend, but certainly from an outside point of view, that's often what the perception can be. And one of the things I'm going to say in this, and I'll leave this as just a thought. So we've talked about the profile and the perception of early education and how we want that needle, as you said, that needle to move. We want to be taken more seriously. We want to be valued. We want to be understood. We want people to understand both the importance of early years, but also why we do things the way we do things. What if, and swim with me on this for a bit, what if just by not using the word play, it changed the perception of early years by itself? If we didn't use the word play, if we had a different lexicon of describing that, it changed how people perceived us and it raised our status. It did move that needle along. Wouldn't that be worth doing?
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent point to finish on. Certainly a lot to think about as well, about the language that we use. Thank you so much, Jan, for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.